In the historic heart of Charleston, Amara Vance's home was meant to be a sanctuary, a quiet end to a long career. But peace is fragile when you're seen as a disruption to an old, established order. On a sunny afternoon, that peace was broken by two men in ill-fitting security uniforms standing on her lawn, sent by the Homeowners Association HOA. They came with an absurd and menacing order. They were there to arrest her. They saw a successful black woman, an unwelcome change in their preserved world. But they made one critical miscalculation. They never considered the quiet man watching from inside the house. So what happens when petty tyranny, disguised as community rules, comes face to face with a hidden power it cannot possibly comprehend? Join us for this story of secrets and quiet strength. I invite you to share your initial thoughts in the comment. And if you enjoy stories with deep characters and slow-burning suspense, perhaps you'll consider subscribing to Deep Who Cater Stories. When politeness shatters. They say that in Charleston, South Carolina, history doesn't whisper. It growls, just beneath a thin veneer of politeness. For Amara Vance, that growl had never felt closer. It didn't come from the ghosts in the old antebellum mansions. It came from the two men standing on her perfectly manicured English lawn and the woman who sent them. They came to arrest a black woman for daring to believe she had the right to peace. But they made a fatal mistake. They knew nothing about her husband. The air on the Battery Promenade was thick with the scent of salt and sweet olive. Humid. Heavy. Just like the silence that now hung over the Vance family's front lawn. Two men in uniforms that read Community Security Services stood before Amara Vance, 52 years old. And she had faced down murderers in courtrooms without flinching. This was no different. The shorter man, Sean, looked nervous. His eyes darted everywhere. The taller one, Eddie, his gaze was a challenge. Behind them stood Beatrice Maybank, 68 years old, the lifelong president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Her face was as serene as a marble statue. A queen observing her court. Eddie reached out. His hand, thick and calloused, closed around Amara's wrist. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice flat. "We've been asked to escort you from the premises." Scashnal bees. The way's the fact of the Dales. Amara didn't pull away. She didn't raise her voice. A former federal prosecutor. Her words were her weapon. Cold, precise. "Take your hand off me," she stated. "Not a request. A fact. This action constitutes assault. For stands of the greet not taken tit." He roosened the daughter, and then the heavy oak door of the house swung open. Elias Vance, Eli, stepped out onto the porch. He said nothing. At 55, dressed in a simple linen shirt and khaki pants. He could have been any other man enjoying an early retirement. He was not. His silence was louder than any shout, more terrifying than any threat. The air, already heavy, seemed to solidify, to crackle. Eli moved. It wasn't fast. It was efficient. A merciless economy of motion. A precise wrist lock. A clean, controlled takedown. Eddie was on his stomach, face down on the grass. Before his mind could even register the attack, Eli knelt with one knee on his back. The weight was immense, pinning him completely. He then looked at Sean. The younger man had already stumbled back, his face as white as a seashell. Eli pulled out his phone. He didn't dial 911. He pressed a single number on his contact list. His voice was low, clear, every word an iron weight. "This is Vance. Authentication, Echo 7. I have a Code 3 situation at my home residence. Requesting an immediate response team. The subject has connections to the Santoro crime family. If you own the formants of the fasted because isn't a permitting the 20 formants the was, it's not 5 form instead of a bested, and maybe form instead of the people that came and rights. I will what of the villages and be in the form instead of the 4. Beatrice Maybank's serene expression finally shattered. A crack in the marble. She didn't know Eli was with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but she knew the name Santoro. That was the underworld she thought she could control. She was wrong. But how did it come to this? How did a quiet Saturday afternoon in one of the South's most prestigious neighborhoods turn into a federal crime scene? To understand that, we have to go back 6 months. To the day Amara and Eli Vance moved to Charleston. They brought with them not just moving boxes, but the ghosts they had desperately hoped to leave behind. Their decision to move was born from a need for quiet, for stillness. Eli had recently retired after a long career as an international security consultant, a vague title for a dangerous life. Amara had accepted a position as a law professor at the Citadel, Charleston's famed military college, a world away from the high-stakes pressure of the Department of Justice. A world away from the past. For Amara, it was about healing. She was searching for peace, for a place to quiet the guilt that was a constant hum beneath the surface of her life, the guilt from an old case, a case that had taken the life of a young colleague, a life she felt responsible for. Charleston, with its ancient beauty and slow, deliberate pace, it seemed like the perfect place to forget, a place to finally breathe. For Eli, it was about Amara. He supported her decision, of course. But the hypervigilance of an undercover agent never truly sleeps. As they toured the historic streets, he wasn't admiring the architecture. He was assessing threats, mapping escape routes. His gaze swept over the wrought iron fences and hidden garden alleys. He worried for her. He knew that their past, did not give up its ghosts so easily. Cracks in the perfect veneer. Beatrice Maybank lived her life as the curator of a beautiful, decaying museum. That museum was Charleston itself, or at least, her version of it. A carefully preserved diorama of a past that never truly existed. 2 weeks after the Vances moved in, Amara saw her in her natural element. At a meeting of the Historical Preservation Society, the gathering was not in a sterile conference room, but in a grand, forgotten ballroom downtown, where massive chandeliers dripped crystal tears onto dusty hardwood floors, and the air was thick with the scent of old velvet and neglect. Beatrice stood at a heavy mahogany podium. She spoke not of history, a collection of facts, but of heritage, a feeling, an inheritance of the soul. Her voice, a soft melody laced with the genteel cadence of the Old South, was mesmerizing. She spoke of the vital importance of purity, the purity of the architectural lines, untouched by modern vulgarity, the purity of the city's legacy. Listening to her, Amara felt a strange chill. The passion in Beatrice's eyes felt less like a civic love for her home, and more like a fierce, desperate obsession. It was the frantic energy of a woman guarding the last and only thing she truly owned, because behind the closed doors of her grand, ancestral mansion on the Battery, the museum was falling apart. The Maybank fortune, built on the backs of forgotten people in fields of rice and indigo centuries ago, was now little more than a ghost haunting the pages of old ledgers. It was a trust fund, bled dry by generations of quiet mismanagement and lavish appearances. The house itself, a landmark on postcards, was quietly surrendering to time and gravity. It was sinking into the marshy soil, millimeter by millimeter. Each year, the antique plumbing groaned in protest. The slate roof, a patchwork of repairs, leaked with every summer storm, staining the silk wallpaper in the upstairs bedrooms. The repairs required a fortune Beatrice no longer had, and so, social standing was her only remaining currency. Her power over the neighborhood, her title as the lifelong president of the Homeowners Association, that was her true inheritance. It was all she had left, and she would protect it with the ferocity of a dragon guarding an empty hoard. A week later, the invitation arrived. Cream-colored cardstock, so thick it felt like a tiny slab of marble. The lettering was engraved. The ink, a deep Charleston green. A welcome tea party at the Maybank residence. For the new neighbors, the Vances. It was presented as a kindness, but it felt like a summons. Amara and Eli walked across the street and into the lion's den. Beatrice greeted them at the door with a smile that was a perfect, practiced curve, but it did not reach her pale, calculating eyes. The house smelled of lemon polish, old roses, and something else, something like dust and secrets. The conversation that followed was a delicate dance, a verbal duel fought with porcelain teacups and antique silver spoons. Beatrice, ever the gracious hostess, asked questions that felt like gentle, surgical probes, invasions disguised as pleasantries. Vance, Beatrice mused, tapping a single, manicured finger on the rim of her china cup. She let the name hang in the air for a moment. A strong name. Solid. From the Virginia Vances. Perhaps Amara knew the question beneath the question. What kind of black people are you? The kind we know? Or the kind we don't? Asterisk. My family's from all over. Amara replied smoothly, her voice even and calm, betraying none of the internal tension. The military has a way of spreading roots far and wide. The Savan ways know as war. I mean the sod of Savute of there. The getting that there is always sod of the Kita de Theresa. Eli stood beside her. I quiet. Solid present. He held a cup and saucer, but the tea remained untouched. He did not participate in the verbal sparring. He simply watched. He was a student of human nature. And this room was a masterclass in deception. He noted the way Beatrice's eyes flickered over Amara's simple, elegant sheath dress. It was an appraisal. He saw the way she looked at his hands, large and scarred from a life she could never comprehend. It was a dismissal, he knew then, with absolute certainty. This woman was not a neighbor. She was an adversary. It was in that suffocatingly polite living room that they met the other players in their new life. Most of the guests offered limp handshakes and fleeting, curious smiles before drifting away, back to their comfortable, familiar circles. But one man approached them with a genuine warmth that felt like a fresh breeze in the stuffy room. Judge Alistair Finch, retired, 75 years old, with kind, crinkled eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the world to be fooled by its pretenses. He shook Eli's hand firmly, then took Amara's. He leaned in slightly, his voice a low, confidential murmur meant only for her. Welcome to Charleston, he said. Don't let these moss-covered walls fool you. Some things around here are even older and more rotten than they are. Anyone that's of guys within no tames of the fair and malice. It was a brief exchange. An anchor of authenticity in a sea of polite hostility. A glimmer of a potential ally. And then there was the obstacle. He stood near the grand fireplace, trying to look casual. Police Chief Franklin Odell. Frank. A man in his late 50s, with a weary face and a uniform that seemed a size too tight across the shoulders. As if carrying a weight he couldn't set down, he was friendly enough. A quick handshake, a tired nod. But he kept his distance. Eli observed the way Frank deferred to Beatrice when she glided over to him. It wasn't just the respect one shows to a prominent citizen from an old family. It was something deeper, a deference born of debt, of a history Eli didn't know, but could feel. Of fear? Eli filed it away. A relationship to be wary of. A complication waiting to happen. They left the party as the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows from the ancient live oaks across the manicured lawns. The air was still warm, but as they walked back to their own front porch, Amara felt a distinct chill. The famous politeness of Charleston. She realized. It wasn't a warm blanket. It was a beautiful, gilded cage. The warning in a cream envelope. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It lay inside their heavy, black metal mailbox, nestled between a glossy home goods catalog and a bland utility bill. An envelope of heavy, cream-colored paper. Expensive. Official. It felt cold to the touch. In the top left corner, the embossed seal of the Battery Promenade Homeowners Association, HOA, was pressed into the paper like a royal decree. Inside, there was no greeting, just a few typed lines. A cold, impersonal reprimand, and at the bottom, the signature of Beatrice Maybank. A flawless, looping script. The violation, an unapproved alteration to the forward-facing landscape. That something's offer word is the fansferateness. The alteration was a magnolia tree, a young sapling, no taller than Amara's shoulder, with broad, waxy green leaves. She had planted it near the porch a week prior. On a quiet Sunday morning, it was a private, quiet act of remembrance, a living memorial for the young colleague whose death still haunted her waking thoughts. The case had taken so much from him, from her. She had wanted to plant something that would grow, something that would produce beautiful, fragrant flowers, a symbol of life, of hope, of a past she was trying to heal from, not erase. For Amara, this was not about a tree. It was not about landscaping regulations. This felt like a violation of something deeply sacred. The letter, with its cold, bureaucratic language, felt like a trespasser, a cold hand reaching into her soul, touching the very wound she had moved across the country to mend. Beatrice's attack on the magnolia felt like an attack on her grief, on her right to heal in the sanctuary of her own home. The guilt, a low hum that was always present just below the surface of her composure, now bubbled with a quiet, righteous anger. This was not just a rule. This was a message, and she would deliver her own in return. She would attend the next HOA meeting. The meeting was held in Beatrice's formal drawing room, the same room where the welcome tea had been held just weeks before. The air was just as thick with the scent of lemon oil and old roses, but the polite pretense had evaporated. Now, it felt less like a parlor and more like a courtroom. Amara sat quietly on a stiff, antique chair, her back straight, listening to the mundane proceedings. A 20-minute debate over the approved shade of black for window shutters, a passive-aggressive complaint about a neighbor's recycling bin being visible from the street for more than the allotted 6 hours. It was a theater of petty power, and Beatrice was the star, director, and producer. Then, Beatrice turned to new business. Her eyes, cool and distant, landed on Amara, a predator singling out its prey. Amara did not wait to be called upon. She stood. The rustle of her dress was the only sound in the room. She held a single piece of paper, a copy of the HOA bylaws. But she did not look at it. She had prepared for this moment not with emotion, but with the cold, hard clarity of the law. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured. It was the voice of a prosecutor. She delivered not a complaint, but a closing argument. She did not speak of her personal reasons for planting the tree. She did not mention her grief or the memory of her fallen colleague. To do so would be to offer a piece of her soul to a woman who would only use it as a weapon. Instead, she spoke of property rights, of state statutes governing homeowners associations. She calmly cited legal precedents from cases in South Carolina where HOAs had overstepped their authority, their language found to be too vague, too arbitrary. She dismantled Beatrice's claim, piece by logical piece, exposing it as not a defense of community standards, but a capricious exercise of personal power. She turned Beatrice's beloved rules into a cage for Beatrice herself. She finished by looking directly at Beatrice Maybank, who sat at the head of the room like a queen on her throne. "Mrs. Maybank," Amara said, her voice echoing slightly in the silent, cavernous room. This association was created to preserve community value, not to serve personal prejudice. And the greatest value of any community is respect. "Is our to do mine now?" Silent. It was absolute. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts. Then, a cough. A dry, rasping sound. An elderly gentleman from down the street, a man who had lived in the neighborhood for 50 years, cleared his throat. "Well, I think she has a point. Beatrice," he said quietly, not looking at Beatrice, but at the floor. Another neighbor, a woman who had been on the receiving end of Beatrice's criticisms for years, nodded in agreement. A small, almost imperceptible murmur of assent rippled through the room. It wasn't a rebellion, but it was a crack in the dam. These were people who had long chafed under Beatrice's thumb, but had never dared to speak up. Amara had given them a voice. Amara had won the argument. She had won the battle. Beatrice's polite, serene smile never wavered, but something in her eyes changed. It was a subtle shift, a cooling. The polite mask of the southern hostess slipped, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, Amara saw the cold, reptilian fury beneath. Beatrice had not just been corrected. She had been publicly humiliated. In her own home, in front of her own court, for a woman whose entire identity was built on social power and unwavering authority. This was an unforgivable insult. At that moment, Beatrice Maybank made a decision. Amara Vance was not a nuisance to be managed. She was an enemy who needed to be removed. Amara had won a battle, but she didn't know that she had just ignited a war. Beatrice Maybank was not a person who backed down. What would she do next? And Eli, the silent husband, how much did he already know about the dangers that were gathering just outside their door? If you have ever had to face a person who abuses their power in your own community, please share your story in the comments below. Sometimes, just knowing you are not alone is the first step toward finding your strength. Ghosts of the past. Humiliation was a foreign feeling to Beatrice Maybank, and she did not wear it well. After the Homeowners Association HOA meeting, a cold, quiet fury settled deep within her. The Vance woman had challenged her. In her own home, in front of her peers, this was not merely an issue of a magnolia tree anymore. It was an issue of control, of order. So Beatrice made a phone call to a man named Silas Croft. On paper, Silas ran a discreet business called Asset Management and Dispute Resolution. In reality, Silas was a bridge between the perfumed, respectable world of Charleston's elite and a much darker, more violent world. He was the man you called when polite society's rules were no longer sufficient. Their meeting was brief, held in the back room of an antique shop south of Broad Street. Beatrice did not say, "Hurt her." She did not need to. The language of her class was one of subtlety, of unspoken commands. "I need Mrs. Vance to understand," Beatrice said, her voice as smooth as polished silver, "that she does not belong here. I need you to persuade her that relocating would be the best option for everyone involved. It's not Monbays that have found the karst." She slid a cashier's check across the table. A significant sum. The last liquid assets from a dying family trust. A desperate financial decision. A point of no return. Silas Croft simply nodded, pocketed the check, and melted back into the city's shadows. Eli felt the shift before he saw it. A subtle change in the rhythm of the neighborhood. A current of wrongness. His years undercover had honed his instincts into a razor's edge. He noticed things. A gray sedan, parked for too long at the end of the street. An unmarked utility van making a slow pass at 3 a.m. The security system he had installed, a silent, sophisticated network, flagged 2 blocked calls from an untraceable number. Small things. Anomalies. He began a quiet investigation, without a word to Amara. He wanted to protect the fragile peace she was trying so desperately to build. He did not want to bring the ghosts of his world into the sanctuary of hers. Working from a secure laptop in his study, late at night when the house was still, he started digging into Silas Croft. The man was a ghost online, a phantom. But Eli had tools the public did not. He accessed restricted databases. He made a few encrypted calls to old, trusted contacts. And what he found chilled him to the bone. Silas Croft wasn't just a local fixer. He was a known associate of the Santoro crime family, the same organization from Amara's old case, the same web of financial corruption and violence that had taken her young colleague's life. Ellie felt a familiar, cold weight settle in his gut. This wasn't a coincidence. The past wasn't just returning. It had been here all along, waiting. That old, relentless guilt gnawed at him. He had been on an assignment overseas when Amara's colleague was killed. He had been too far away to help, too far away to protect. He had sworn to himself, never again. This time, he thought, his hands clenching into fists. I will not fail. He was torn, one part of him, the husband, wanted to shield Amara from this darkness. The other part, the agent, knew that the threat was already at their door. Amara noticed the change in him, the way he stood by the window for a little too long, his gaze fixed on the street, the quiet tension in his shoulders, the way he checked the locks on the doors twice before bed. He was slipping back into the man he used to be, the man he had promised to leave behind. One evening, as they sat on the back porch. The fireflies beginning their nightly dance over the marsh. She decided to confront the silence between them. She asked him directly, "There's something you're not telling me. Isn't there, Eli?" He hesitated. For a long moment, he stared out into the gathering, dark. He wanted to tell her everything, but he didn't want to shatter the illusion of a normal life, of retirement, of peace. So he chose a half-truth. "I don't like that man Beatrice has been seen with Thousand," he said, his voice low. "Silas Croft. Just be careful. Thanks for watching in a fun of that everything in the marketly resonated." The conversation hung in the air, unfinished, a testament to the wall between them, built from years of secrets and unspoken fears. Amara felt the sting of being shut out. Eli, in his mind, believed he was protecting her. The gap between them widened, and in that space, the ghosts of the past began to gather. The fateful Saturday. The plan, as Beatrice had outlined it to Silas Croft, was simple, elegant, even a public humiliation. Silas's men, Eddie and Sean, would arrive under the guise of community security. They would stage a confrontation, a dramatic, yet supposedly legal, citizen's arrest. They would accuse Amara of some new, fabricated violation. They would make a scene, frighten her, shame her in front of the entire neighborhood. The goal was not physical harm. It was psychological warfare, to make her feel so unwelcome, so besieged, that she would simply leave. But Silas Croft did not know his man, Eddie, and Beatrice did not know Silas. She did not know that Eddie had his own agenda, a much darker one. For Eddie, this was not just a job. It was an opportunity, a golden, long-awaited chance for revenge. The moment he learned the target's address, the moment he realized whose wife he would be confronting, the job changed. It became personal. And so, the stage was set on that humid Saturday afternoon. The air hung still and heavy, pregnant with the coming storm. When Eddie's hand closed around Amara's wrist, she did not feel fear. She felt a cold, familiar anger, a profound sense of indignation. This was not the first time a man had tried to use physical intimidation to silence her. In courtrooms, in deposition rooms, she had faced down men far more dangerous than this one. Her prosecutor's mind switched on. She was no longer a homeowner on her lawn. She was an officer of the court observing a crime in progress. She analyzed his stance, the way his weight was distributed. She noted Sean's nervous shuffling behind him, a weak link. She assessed the distance to her front door. Every detail was cataloged, processed. She was already building her case. Inside the house, Eli saw the hand on his wife's arm through the wavy glass of the drawing room window, and in that instant, a switch flipped deep inside his mind. It was a switch he had spent years learning to control, to keep buried beneath a carefully constructed facade of quiet retirement. But it was always there. The man who drank coffee on the porch disappeared. The husband who discussed gardening with his wife vanished. In his place stood the operative, all emotion drained away. There was no rage, no panic, only a cold, crystalline clarity. He did not see a neighborhood bully. He saw a threat, a target that needed to be neutralized. His movement out the door was not born of anger. It was an execution, a precise, calculated response to a clear and present danger, to the one thing in the world he was sworn to protect. Beatrice watched from the sidewalk, a safe distance away. A flicker of ugly satisfaction warmed her chest as she saw Amara being physically restrained. The woman's composure was finally cracking. The plan was working. But then, the front door opened. Eli Vance stepped out. The satisfaction in Beatrice's chest turned cold. An icy knot of unease. There was something about the way he moved. The utter stillness of his face, and when he called his contact, when he spoke the name Santoro into the phone, the icy knot became a chasm of pure, sickening dread. Beatrice Maybank finally understood. She had not hired a dog to scare a cat. She had rattled a cage, not knowing that inside it slept a tiger, a monster she never knew existed, living right here, in her pristine, orderly world within minutes. The quiet street was a sea of flashing lights. Blue and red strobed across the pale facades of the historic homes. But these were not just the local police. Unmarked sedans, dark and serious, pulled up silently. Men in plain clothes, wearing earpieces and moving with a quiet, efficient purpose, emerged and secured the scene. Police Chief Frank Odell arrived, his face a mask of confusion and alarm. He saw Eli, no longer looking like a retiree, but speaking in low, urgent tones with a man in a suit who was clearly in charge. Frank's local authority evaporated in the face of this federal storm. He was a ship captain caught in a hurricane. Amara stood on her porch, watching it all unfold. She looked at her husband, the man she shared her life with, the quiet, gentle man she thought had left the battlefield behind. She realized now he had never truly left. He had just brought the war home with him, and the enemy had followed. In that moment, Amara Vance understood a bitter truth. They had never really escaped the past. They had only been living in the quiet eye of the storm, and the second storm had just begun. Inside the interrogation room. Hours later, the world had shrunk. It had shrunk to the size of a small, windowless room in a Federal Bureau of Investigation safe house on the outskirts of Charleston. The furniture was government-issued, simple, functional, utterly anonymous. Has beige couch, a coffee table made of cheap laminate. It was a place designed for secrets, not for living. The stark contrast to their elegant, history-filled home on the Battery was a quiet, brutal statement. The life they had tried to build, it was gone. An illusion shattered. Amara sat on the couch. A cup of coffee, when touched, grew cold on the table before her. Eli stood across the room, his back to her, staring at a blank wall as if he could see the entire world mapped out upon it. The silence between them was no longer just a space. It was a weight, heavy with unspoken truths. This was the center of the story, the moment where everything had to be said. For the first time, stripped of all pretense, Eli was forced to tell his wife the truth. He turned to face her. His eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a deep, weary pain. He wasn't retired. His assignment was Charleston, the Centauro organization. The same one from Amara's old case had not been destroyed. It had merely changed its shape. Like a cancer, it had metastasized. They had moved from complex financial crimes into a new, more insidious business. Money laundering. Using the city's historic preservation funds and real estate trusts as their washing machine. Charleston was their new headquarters. And then came the confession. The real one. The one that had burdened him for years. He confessed his guilt. He admitted that he had requested this assignment. That he had pulled strings to be placed here. Not just to finish the job, but to protect her. To be sluggish for his own failure. For not being there when her young colleague, Daniel, was killed. He had been chasing shadows in another country. And the guilt of that distance, it had been his constant companion ever since. Amara listened. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. When he finished, a profound sadness settled over her. It was not angry. It was a deep, aching sorrow. The sorrow of realizing that a lie, even one born from love and protection, had been living between them. A wall she never knew existed. She felt a sharp pang of hurt. Not because he was an agent, but because he had not trusted her. Not enough to share the weight of his burden. You weren't protecting me. Eli, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it filled the sterile room. You were just imprisoning yourself in the past, and you pulled me in there with you. And one of the plaid to find her miser, miles away. In another sterile room, Beatrice Maybank faced her own reckoning. She sat at a steel table in an interrogation room at the FBI field office. She had maintained her aristocratic composition. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her left hand betrayed the fear beneath the surface. Across from her sat a young, sharp-eyed agent, a colleague of Eli's. He did not ask about the incident on Amara Vance's lawn. He didn't mention assault or false imprisonment. Instead, he asked about finances. He spoke of the Charleston Preservation Fund, the charitable foundation Beatrice had managed for decades. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were bank statements, wire transfers, a complex web of anonymous donations flowing from shell corporations, corporations that the FBI had definitively linked to the Santoro family. He spoke. She listened. The agent's words were calm, factual, devoid of accusation, but each word was a hammer blow, chipping away at the foundation of her world. Her mind reeled. She was not the master of this game. She was not a queen moving her pieces on a chessboard. She was a pawn, a useful, well-positioned pawn, but a pawn nonetheless, used by men far more powerful and ruthless than she could have ever imagined. Her desperate fear of losing her family's legacy, of becoming irrelevant, it had led her to make a deal with the very same kind of corruption that had ruined so many others. Beatrice Maybank finally broke. It was not a loud, dramatic collapse. It was a quiet implosion. Her shoulders slumped. The regal posture vanished. She looked down at her trembling hands. And for the first time in a very long time, she saw herself not as a protector of heritage, but as a fool who had sold her soul to protect an empty house. The quiet hum of the room's ventilation system was the only sound, the sound of a life coming to an end. The choices of allies and enemies. Judge Alistair Finch's private library smelled of old paper, leather, and bourbon. It was a sanctuary of knowledge and quiet contemplation, with the Bureau's blessing. Eli and Amara sat in deep wingback chairs across from the retired judge. The afternoon sun cast long, dusty rays through the tall windows. Eli laid it all out. The Santoro family, the money laundering, Beatrice Maybank's desperate entanglement. He spoke not as a neighbor, but as an operative. He needed more than just a friend. He needed an asset. Someone with unimpeachable credibility who understood the intricate web of favors and secrets that held Charleston's elite together. The judge listened. His hands steepled under his chin. He was not surprised. He nodded slowly, a deep sadness in his old eyes. He had suspected a rot like this for years, a decay hidden behind polite society. He then told them a story of his own, about his daughter, a bright, tenacious investigative journalist. Years ago, she had been looking into questionable land deals involving some of Charleston's founding families, shady transactions, hidden shell corporations. Then, there was an accident, a single-car crash on a rain-slicked road. The case was closed. But, for a father, a case like that is never closed. He looked at Amara, and in her, he saw the same fire that had burned in his daughter, the same unwavering commitment to the truth. For Judge Finch, this was not just about helping a neighbor. It was about finishing his daughter's fight. It was about finding justice. Long delayed, he agreed to be their eyes and ears inside the world they could not penetrate. Meanwhile, in a sterile, windowless room in a federal building downtown, Police Chief Frank Odell was having a very different conversation. Two of Eli's colleagues, polite but firm, had invited him to cooperate. They didn't accuse him of anything. They simply laid out the evidence on the table between them. Financial records, wiretap transcripts, surveillance photos, a clear, undeniable line connecting Beatrice Maybank to the Santoro organization. Then, they gave him a choice. He could cooperate fully, use his deep, local knowledge of the city's power structures to help their investigation. Or, he could become a subject of that investigation himself. Obstruction of justice, aiding and abetting. His career, his pension, his freedom, all of it was now on the table. This was the moment that would define the rest of Frank Odell's life. Everything he was built on a foundation of loyalty. Loyalty to the old families. Loyalty to the system that had made him who he was. Loyalty to Beatrice, whose family had once saved him from a youthful mistake that would have ruined him. That loyalty was now at war with the oath he had taken, the badge he wore, the law he was sworn to uphold. He wasn't a hero. He was a practical man. And looking at the cold, hard evidence on the table, he knew Beatrice's ship was sinking, and he had to choose whether to go down with her or to swim for shore. He chose the shore. not out of courage, but out of a simple, powerful instinct: survival. And then there was Sean, the younger man who had stood on the lawn with Eddie, scared, in over his head. He was cooperating completely, eagerly. In his debriefing, he confirmed every detail of Beatrice's plan, her instructions to Silas Croft. But he revealed something more, something crucial. He told the agents about Eddie's obsession, about the vendetta. He recounted how Eddie had gloated about the opportunity to get revenge on the federal agent who had put his older brother away, Eli Vance. This confirmed it. The threat was not just from a desperate old woman. It was from the remnants of a wounded and very dangerous criminal organization. One man chose justice for a love that was lost. Another chose justice for fear of the future. Every player was now at a crossroad, and their choices would shape the final act of this story. The battle was no longer on a front lawn. It had moved into the gilded drawing rooms and the most powerful offices in Charleston. If you are still listening, please help me by commenting the number 1 below, so I know I still have friends on this journey with me. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to tell the final part, where the deepest secrets will be revealed, and where Amara and Eli must face the ultimate test of their love and their survival. The final plan. Back in the safe house, the air had changed. The heavy silence of secrets was gone. In its place was something new, a quiet understanding. The wall that had stood between Amara and Eli for 6 months had crumbled. There were no more lies, only a shared purpose, a deep, resonant respect. They spread the case files across the cheap laminate table, old files from Amara's original prosecution, their pages soft and worn. New files from Eli's current investigation, filled with crisp surveillance photos and dense financial reports. For hours, they were a team. Amara, with her prosecutor's mind, saw the pattern, the legal loopholes, the vulnerabilities in their opponent's armor that Eli, the field agent, might have missed. She saw the shape of the crime in the dry language of tax codes and property deeds. Eli, in turn, explained the human element, the structure of the new Santoro organization. He drew diagrams on a notepad, showing her how the power flowed, who answered to whom. He brought the names on the pages to life. They were no longer just a husband and wife. They were two professionals, masters of their respective crafts, combining their skills for a single, critical purpose. The financial details were intricate, devious. The Santoro organization was exploiting federal and state tax credit programs designed to encourage the preservation of historic buildings. It was a brilliant, cynical scheme. They would use a shell corporation to buy a dilapidated historic property for a low price. Then, they would wildly inflate the costs of the restoration work on paper, using invoices from other companies they secretly controlled. Finally, they would submit these fraudulent expenses to the government and receive massive tax refunds. Public money, meant to save history, was being laundered to fund a criminal enterprise. It was Amara who found the key, the vulnerability. "They're too greedy," she said, tapping a finger on a complex flowchart of money transfers. "The whole system depends on a final approval from a legitimate investor. They need a clean partner to sign off. That's where we can get them." The plan began to form. Using intelligence from Judge Finch and the now cooperative Chief Odell, Eli's team identified the Santoro organization's next target, a historic warehouse on the waterfront, poised for a multi-million-dollar restoration. They would set a trap. They would create a fake investment group, ready to partner on the project. They would lure the head of the Charleston operation into a meeting, but the plan required a lead player, someone to be the face of the investment group, someone who could speak the language of high finance and complex real estate law with absolute confidence, someone who could sit across the table from a killer and not betray an ounce of fear. That person was Amara. Eli's reaction was immediate. A flat, hard no. His entire mission, his entire reason for being here, was to keep her out of this world, to protect her from the very danger she was now proposing to walk directly into. The thought of it sent a cold dread through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the day he learned her colleague had been killed. But Amara was resolute. The woman who had come to Charleston seeking peace was gone. In her place was the prosecutor who had once stared down the Santoro family in open court. This was her fight. It had always been her fight. She looked at her husband, her eyes clear and steady. "You've fought in the dark long enough, Eli," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "Now, let me finish this in the light. In watching this main Shaby and Stavely, so watching this main Shaby and the Maris, it was not a plea, it was a statement of fact. In that moment, Eli saw that she was not running from her past anymore. She was confronting it, reclaiming it. This decision was not about revenge. It was about healing, about taking back her own power, and he knew he could not stand in her way. The final plan. Back in the safe house, the air had changed. The heavy silence of secrets was gone. In its place was something new, a quiet understanding. The wall that had stood between Amara and Eli for 6 months had crumbled. There were no more lies, only a shared purpose, a deep, resonant respect. They spread the case files across the cheap laminate table, old files from Amara's original prosecution, their pages soft and worn, new files from Eli's current investigation, filled with crisp surveillance photos and dense financial reports. For hours, they worked. A team. Amara, with her prosecutor's mind, saw the pattern, the legal loopholes, the vulnerabilities in their opponent's armor that Eli, the field agent, might have missed. She saw the shape of the crime in the dry language of tax codes and property deeds. Eli, in turn, explained the human element, the structure of the new Santoro organization. He drew diagrams on a notepad, showing her how the power flowed, who answered to whom. He brought the names on the pages to life. They were no longer just a husband and wife. They were two professionals, masters of their respective crafts, combining their skills for a single, critical purpose. The financial details were intricate, devious. The Santoro organization was exploiting federal and state tax credit programs designed to encourage the preservation of historic buildings. It was a brilliant, cynical scheme. They would use a shell corporation to buy a dilapidated historic property for a low price. Then, they would wildly inflate the costs of the restoration work on paper, using invoices from other companies they secretly controlled. Finally, they would submit these fraudulent expenses to the government and receive massive tax refunds. Public money, meant to save history, was being laundered to fund a criminal enterprise. It was Amara who found the key, the vulnerability. "They're too greedy," she said, tapping a finger on a complex flowchart of money transfers. "The whole system depends on a final approval from a legitimate investor. They need a clean partner to sign off. That's where we can get them." The plan began to form. Using intelligence from Judge Finch and the now cooperative Chief Odell, Eli's team identified the Santoro organization's next target, a historic warehouse on the waterfront, poised for a multi-million-dollar restoration. They would set a trap. They would create a fake investment group, ready to partner on the project. They would lure the head of the Charleston operation into a meeting, but the plan required a lead player, someone to be the face of the investment group, someone who could speak the language of high finance and complex real estate law with absolute confidence, someone who could sit across the table from a killer and not betray an ounce of fear. That person was Amara. Eli's reaction was immediate. A flat, hard no. His entire mission, his entire reason for being here, was to keep her out of this world, to protect her from the very danger she was now proposing to walk directly into. The thought of it sent a cold dread through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the day he learned her colleague had been killed. But Amara was resolute. The woman who had come to Charleston seeking peace was gone. In her place was the prosecutor who had once stared down the Santoro family in open court. This was her fight. It had always been her fight. She looked at her husband, her eyes clear and steady. "You've fought in the dark long enough, Eli," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "Now, let me finish this in the light. In watching this main Shaby and Stavely, so watching this main Shaby and the Maris, it was not a plea, it was a statement of fact. In that moment, Eli saw that she was not running from her past anymore. She was confronting it, reclaiming it. This decision was not about revenge. It was about healing, about taking back her own power, and he knew he could not stand in her way. Joe. Part 9. Sunset on the Ashley River. The final meeting took place at sunset, on a luxury yacht gliding silently across the Ashley River. The water reflected the sky's brilliant orange and deep purple hues. It was a scene of perfect, manufactured tranquility. Amara, playing the part of a wealthy investor from Atlanta, sat across a polished mahogany table from the man at the center of the web. He was not a thug. He was not a gangster from a movie. His name was Julian Devereaux, a respected real estate attorney, a philanthropist, a man whose family name was woven into the very fabric of Charleston. The perfect wolf, hiding in the most expensive sheep's clothing. Their conversation was a chess match, a high-stakes game played with polite words and subtle gestures. Julian spoke of tax credits, of historic preservation grants, of loopholes in federal funding. He was charming, persuasive. He saw Amara as another wealthy client, eager to hide her money in the city's complex financial architecture. He did not see the former federal prosecutor who had spent years studying his kind. He did not see the trap. Amara, with the precision of a surgeon, guided the conversation. She asked the right questions. She feigned ignorance at the right moments. She created openings for his arrogance to fill. And he did. He began to boast, to reveal details about how the Santoro family funneled money through the very charities he sat on the board of. He explained how they used people like Beatrice Maybank, desperate, proud people clinging to a faded legacy, as unwitting shields. He laid out the entire criminal enterprise, not knowing that a tiny, nearly invisible microphone hidden in Amara's brooch was broadcasting every self-incriminating word to a surveillance van parked a mile away. The trap sprung just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was not a dramatic raid. It was quiet, efficient. 2 unmarked boats from the Federal Bureau of Investigation approached the yacht from either side. Agents, dressed in plain clothes, stepped aboard. There was no shouting, no resistance. Julian Devereaux simply stared at Amara, his charming smile finally dissolving into a look of pure, unadulterated shock. The decade-long case, the ghost that had haunted Amara for so long, was finally over. Months passed. The seasons in Charleston began to turn. Beatrice Maybank pleaded guilty. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she cooperated fully, detailing every transaction, every secret meeting. She lost everything: her reputation, her home. The Grand Maybank mansion was seized by the federal government, its contents to be auctioned off. A sad, final chapter for a dying dynasty. Amara and Eli returned to their house on the Battery. The street was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, a settled quiet. The neighbors no longer looked at them with suspicion, but with a newfound respect, a quiet admiration. Judge Finch became a regular visitor, often stopping by for iced tea on their back porch in the late afternoon. The silent war was over. One evening, they sat together on that same porch. The air was cool. The scent of jasmine hung heavy in the air. The small magnolia tree that Amara had planted, the tree that had started it all, was now covered in small, velvety white buds. The first signs of new life. Eli reached across the small table between them and took her hand. His touch was gentle, grounding. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and sincere, "for not telling you sooner. Place so flang far." Amara looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. A genuine, peaceful smile touched her lips, a smile free from the shadows that had followed her for so long. "We all have our ghosts, Eli," she said softly. "The important thing is that we don't have to face them alone anymore. That standard in the Shures, in Charleston, where history growls. The Vances had found their peace, not by running from the past, but by facing it. Together, they had come here seeking a place of rest, but they found healing instead. And sometimes, that is the truest form of happiness. The battle was over, but their journey, as partners, had only just begun. As our story concludes, it leaves me with a thought that echoes the title itself. Have you ever witnessed a moment where a bully, armed with petty rules and prejudice, came face to face with a level of quiet power they could never have comprehended? The title promised a confrontation, And for me, the most unforgettable part was that single, chilling moment when the quiet husband stepped onto his porch. It wasn't about the physical action that followed, but the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the instant that facade of a simple retiree dissolved to reveal a lifetime of danger and discipline beneath. It's a powerful reminder that true authority doesn't need a uniform or a title like HOA president. Real power is often silent, steady, and utterly unshakable until it is provoked. I would be truly honored to hear your thoughts. What did you feel in that moment when the tables turned so completely? If you enjoy stories where justice is served with such quiet, satisfying strength, I warmly invite you to consider subscribing to Dipucator Stories. Thank you, sincerely, for being a companion on this journey with me today. Until our next story, take good care.